coders! Today we'll be learning the basics of CSS, including proper syntax, colors, backgrounds, image sizing, margins and paddings, fonts, and how they can be used to style a website. Let's start with a question. CSS, also known as cascading style sheets, is a coding language that is used to define how HTML is displayed. If HTML is the website skeleton, CSS is the skin. To better understand what CSS does, let's look at a few example websites with and without CSS.
Here we see a browser web page most of us use every day, although at a glance right now you probably wouldn't recognize it. The page is unmanageable and confusing. However, adding our CSS, we see a familiar site. The search bar reappears and we see our classic logo, Google. Here's another example. Without CSS, HTML stays its initial formatting with exposed links, simple bulleted lists, and unformatted images all shifted to the left. After adding our CSS, the navigability of the page becomes simpler, more intuitive, and more pleasing to the eye. All these aspects makes your page more accessible to users, which is why it's so important.
To get started, here's the syntax of all CSS. Selector, curly braces, property, colon, value, semicolon. For example, if you want to address a header from your HTML file, you would write a header followed by curly braces, the property you want to customize, for example color, and the value, for example red. To address IDs, you would write a hashtag and the ID name, and for classes, it's a period and the class name. You'll notice that without CSS, only the HTML is shown, which means that there's the default coloring, images aren't sized, and the pages aren't formatted in a way that's easy for users to navigate. This is the importance of CSS.
Now let's use this knowledge to change the color of a paragraph. First, we write P with the curly braces. Inside of the curly braces is color. And we can use a hex code like this to refer to a color, or an RGB code, or an HSL code. We can also refer to a color simply by stating the color name. By typing blue, it'll use a standard blue color, and so on.
What if we want to change the background of our website? We can do this with the properties of background color and background image. Similar to the color of the text, we can do the same thing to change the color of the background just by using a different property. If you want to use an image for the background, you can use background image, followed by the URL. Make sure you add the parentheses. Add a path to your image, like an image address or the name of an imported file. We noticed before that websites are able to size images and icons so they don't take up the entire screen. We can do this with the properties height and width. We have a few options on how to assign values to these properties. We can use auto and the browser will calculate a default height and width, or we can use percentages. For example, height 25% will increase it to be 25% of the initial height. We can also use initial if we just want the image to be the original size. We can also adjust the size in pixels by saying number of pixels followed by px. These properties and values can also be used when sizing other elements like divs.
Now that we know some basic CSS, let's make our website more organized with margins and padding. Both properties create space around an element, but padding is the space between the element and the borders, while margins is the space between the element and other elements. We can address the values of these properties with percent or pixels. For example, padding 20 pixels, or margin 10%. Say you only want margins or padding on one side of the element. We can do this by saying margins or padding top, left, right, or bottom.
Lastly, let's learn how we can change the generic fonts of a website. CSS has 5 generic font families: serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fancy. If you don't want to use any of these generic fonts, you can import a font. Here is an example. If you will want all your text on your page to use Times New Roman, you can write body, curly bracket, font family, colon, Times New Roman, semicolon, close curly bracket. This sets the default font for the entire web page. Next, if you want the heading to look different, you can style the tags separately. For example, H1, curly bracket, font family, colon, serif, semicolon, close curly bracket. In the preview, we see an example of how the body will look like with the font Times New Roman. The CSS will be connected to the HTML's body. So that's how you use CSS to control fonts on your web page. Super simple and super useful.
That's it for this video. We hope it was helpful. For more information on cascading style sheets, visit W3 Schools or comment down below suggestions for future tutorials. Thanks for watching.